The catalogue that has been created of the Dublin Journal of Medical and Chemical Science is one of the most useful tools, I think, for medical historians, social historians and historians of ideas that has been developed in the last while. First of all, I'll just give a little bit of background on the Dublin Journal of Medical and Chemical Science, because first of all it changed its name a lot of times and it was a very important journal and some people may not be familiar with it. And I suppose what I'm trying to do there is justify why bother cataloguing the contents, why create this catalogue. Well, the Dublin Journal of Medical and Chemical Science, to give its full name, was first established in 1832 and it is the longest running medical periodical in Ireland, and it still is in existence. Amongst its contributors and editors are some of the most famous Irish medical practitioners of the 19th and 20th centuries. The only other specifically medical journal operating in the 19th century was the Dublin Medical Press and Circular. And the intention of this catalogue is to open up the DJMS as a source for historians at all levels who are developing an analytical and contextual approach to their subject. Prior to the creation of this catalogue, getting into this material, trying to get a handle on the wealth of material that's in this journal was extremely cumbersome and extremely time-consuming. The two main indices for the DJMS in existence prior to this were the electronic journal database called Springer Link, and of course good old Hayes Sources for Irish Civilization, the articles in Irish periodicals, and of course Hayes is now searchable electronically through sources on the National Library of Ireland website. And while these are very useful in many respects, they are limited in focus. And they concentrated only on the original articles published in the journal. So they really only focus on the medical archives, or the medical articles. So the IVRLA project has, for the first time, catalogued every individual entry in the journal, including book reviews, obituaries, clinical notes, special reports, occasional adverts. So the catalogue then is an invaluable tool which allow users to search over 117 years of some of the most valuable data and developments of Irish medical history. Now, how do we do it? Well, basically, I believe in simplicity when it comes to these things. You basically just go onto the IVRLA website, you enter the Dublin Journal of Medical Science, and what you get essentially are 6 Excel databases. So it's actually very simple, very easy to use. And they cover the whole period 1832 to 69. You can then download the one you're interested in, and you can download it onto your desktop. And you have then a full index of the journal for that period. You can also, of course, get additional background information on the journal, on the scope of the different databases, etc., etc. And then to allow for easy use, basically, it is an Excel spreadsheet. It's very simple, as I said, it's a tool. And there are different categories. The main categories where you can search material is under author, title, date, category of entry, location, and there are other ones, but they're the key ones to search by. You can also search by free text, which is very useful. So what kind of information is in it, and how can we use it in teaching and research? Well, I presume we all know that this type of journal contains, as you can imagine, very useful information on contemporary medical understandings of disease, surgery, etc., the most obvious things. But I think for our purposes today, I try to consider some additional themes that can be drawn out when we use these search categories. So instead of sort of throwing up and using articles about the history of insanity or something, I thought we'd look at some more general themes that we can pull out from the material. So focusing solely on the articles published in the journal, so if you just look at the sort of article section, the title of the articles, what we can track here, for instance, is the developments within medical profession, and more specifically within their intellectual influences during the 19th and the first half of the 20th centuries. For instance, a very quick browse of the first series of the journal for the 1832-45 series. What you see is an extremely high number of European medical practitioners publishing in what is essentially a very local Dublin journal at this stage. So examples would be, for instance, the French alienist Jean Esqualiar, who was a key figure in the medicalisation of mental illness in the early 19th century and an important influence on Charcot, the French neurologist who was accredited with the development of the 19th century concept of hysteria. So he's being published in these journals. You also have other figures who are very key in the period. But this contrasts quite remarkably with the 20th century in the journal. Where actually now, I'm not saying that the European influence disappears, it's still there, but it's reduced quite significantly. So you sort of get a sense that the intellectual sources for Irish medicine is shifting more to the English-speaking world, I suspect. I don't know, I haven't assessed it, but I suspect that's what's going on there. And it's also as well possible when you do something as basic as this, just look at the categories, it's also possible to identify the consolidation of medical specialisms within the profession. Again, if we look at the early 19th century, when medical specialism was generally frowned on, the true sort of medical luminary was meant to be, you know, a man who could treat all illness, all ailments. And this is very much reflected when you look at the early entries. There's very relatively few reports on what we would understand to be specialisms. Instead, you have the general headings, which I've just thrown up there, of chemical and physical science, of botany and natural history. They're very, you know, pathology and therapeutics. They're very general. And then when you throw up a later search on this, what you actually see are specialisms such as the emergence of, say, emergency medicine, and much more strongly in the 20th century. What's also interesting when you do a search like this is you can see changes in the methodologies around medical research and medical protocols. By the beginning of the 20th century, you see authors or papers being published have several authors instead of just one author. And that's clearly an example here. You can see there, author 1, author 2, I hid. But you can see it there. And that, of course, reflects the greater complexity of medical research by the 20th century, and also the move, which we're all very familiar with, I suppose, today, the move towards research in teams in medicine in the 20th century. The contents of the journal, of course, also reflected the interests or preoccupations of individual editors, and we can never move away from that. So, for instance, John Moore, Dr. John William Moore, who was editor from 1875, his primary interest was in infectious diseases, but particularly in the relationship between infectious diseases and climate changes. He was a committed meteorologist, and he contributed monthly notes on sanitary and meteorological information. And he published these basically from 1879 to 1919, and he collected them from his own observations and from findings on climate in Ireland and Britain, and bringing them all together with patterns of infectious disease outbreaks. It's fascinating material. I'm not quite sure if it's of any meaning, but it's fascinating material. And of course, this focus on infectious disease and developments of understandings of infectious disease continues into the 20th century, and the most obvious is, of course, a huge number of articles on TB. You see the number just skyrocketing in that period. Another important development under Moore's editorialship was the incorporation of the Irish Hospital Gazette into the journal. Now, its inclusion was mainly prompted by difficulties in ensuring that there was enough copy for the monthly journal. Moore had a real problem he decided he'd go for a monthly journal. He had a real panic because, of course, he couldn't get enough people to write enough articles, a real panic about it. So he approached the Hospital Gazette, and they agreed to basically come under the umbrella of the journal. But this is really important for us because, of course, it means that we have annual reports from hospitals, such as the Coombe Hospital, which are gone, many of which are gone. And it also reminds us, on a broader question, it reminds us of the commitment Irish medicine had towards medical institutions that perhaps differs from, say, Britain. That commitment to the institution. The catalogue also reinforces, for me certainly, the way in which, or the importance in which, medical journals acted as conduits of more than just intellectual stimuli, the way they also contained more prosaic information, or what we could perhaps see as more prosaic information. For instance, the journals are used to advertise medical commodities, Epsom salts, Scott's emulsions, all these things that are questionable if you want to assess their efficacy. Also, if you look, I don't know if you can actually read that, but if you look down there, you can also see the adverts for private institutions. If you look 2 above where the little blue line is, It's a private institution for people suffering with nervous disorders. And this is where they touted for business, essentially. They gave their rates and, promised discretion, etc., etc. You can also, when you look along those adverts, and you can see I've just searched by advert there, you can see the adverts for jobs. Okay, the most obvious being in hospitals. They're listed there. But what's interesting, and it's actually not on that snapshot, is some of the jobs advertised with the Indian Medical Service, quite frequently advertised in the journal, suggesting, they are reminding us again of the impact of medical migration on the profession. And you also see other things, educational courses, all those type of very prosaic things that are in the journal, and it allows us, I suppose, to track incomes of doctors, all these type of issues. It also reminds us, of course, the degree to which medicine is always related to entrepreneurship in this country. This notion that you can sell things in a journal as well as have your professional job. And finally, I suppose, for a broader issue, the journal is an invaluable source on biographical information. During Wilde's time, when he was editor, he introduced a new feature which basically included memoirs of famous Irish doctors, the great luminaries. And they're very useful. People like Stokes and Graves, we have memoirs of them. But from 1920, increasingly the journal included the obituary section of, less well-known individuals, the local hospital doctor, the individual who's often forgotten about, and it's then very hard to find any information on them. Okay? So these are much shorter reports, they're less illustrious, but they're vital resources when you're trying to get a sense of individual doctors practicing in small areas. And they also allow us, I suppose, as medical historians and social historians, to move our focus away from the exceptional to the more prosaic and probably the more representative of these things. So I suppose the journal is, I would say, a very important resource for historians of all levels, from your first year student who wants to first encounter this material to a more complex PhD student. It can tell us, I would very much argue, about the intellectual development of the Irish medical profession. It tells us a lot about how a profession can consolidate itself. And it also, as Mary alluded to in the introduction, it provides some insight into the social and cultural history of a relatively small but quite powerful elite group in Irish society. And I suppose this project, I would like to say, is a very important step to making this material accessible. So thank you.